And hello once again, my name is LC Lupus, and today I'm going to be talking about prose/narrative, which is a concept, one of the major literary genres in literary theory, if you are doing literary theory or theory of literature as it can also be known, and that is what I'm going to be going over today. Now, I have already made a video going over it in very, very basic terms, sort of discussing it in general, along with the other major literary genres, which is poetry, prose, and drama. So this is the second one, prose/narrative, because sometimes prose, it's not a term you come across very often unless you're more embroiled in this particular sad lifestyle, that is academia. So let's talk about this, but before we jump into any of that, let me just say that I've made a bunch of these videos over the years, helping a lot of students and such with these literary concepts, and if you appreciate that kind of stuff, or if you want to support the kind of stuff that I do, you can check out the books that I have written. Seeing as we're talking about prose today, let me just say one of my books, which would be something like Flesh Zone Blues, which is a fun old cyberpunk story, which is basically like sad sci-fi. So if you want to support me, you can check out a book like that. Now let's get to the actual video. Let's talk about prose and narrative. So what is prose? Now, when we talk about prose, generally we're talking about things like novels, short stories, novelettes, novellas, blah, 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 that kind of stuff. That is what we are talking about when we talk about prose. Now, we're going to get a little bit more into the weeds here, talking about the specific things that often differentiate prose from the other genres. What are the things that are specific to prose? Now, we're going to first talk about Genet. Gerard Genet was an academic. He is, I assume, dead now, but he wrote a very, very important book called Narrative Discourse, and also Narrative Discourse Revisited, which, I'll be perfectly honest, had the certain parts in that second book that were very whiny, but it was quite funny. So we're not going to talk about that, though. Anyway, so according to Genet, who was one of the major figures in narratology, which is prose, he said that narrative is made up of a story and the narration. Now, I've also put these other words here next to these terms of story and narration, where story can also be called histoire or fabula, and narration can be called narration or chizette. Now, these are different concepts. Histoire and narration are obviously, as you can tell by the way I said them, French, and fabula and chizette are Russian. So, very fun little concepts here. The story, aka histoire, aka the fabula, is what happens in a narrative, right? When you're thinking about a story, right? A book, a movie, it doesn't matter. When you think about one of those, what actually happens in it? What is the plot? What is the story? That is the story slash histoire slash fabula. So then narration. What is narration? Narration, aka narration and chizette, is the specific way in which that story is conveyed to you, right? So basically he's saying that narrative is made up of a story and the way that the story is told to you, which is kind of obvious, but it's good to think about things in these sorts of terms. So basically just think, okay, a story, what happens? Now, how's it told to me? Is it told to me through whose perspective? Who is telling me this story? What is the order in which they're telling me the story? Is the story in chronological order, or is it in a different order? Right? Is it sort of saying it starts at the beginning and then it does the middle and then it does the end? Or think about how many movies actually start at the end and then the entire movie is a flashback to how it started. Right? That is a difference in the order in which it is told. Right? Where is it told? Who is the narrator? How does the narrator know what they know? How do we know these things? These are all the narration, which is actually kind of the more interesting part of storytelling in many ways. How is the story conveyed to the audience? So let's get into some of these things. So some of the major concepts are things like the narrative / the plot, which is actually what the story is about. Perfectly honest, there isn't much more I can say about that, right? What is the story about? Now, obviously, you can go into things like the themes and the ideas that are explored. Those are the kind of things you can also talk about when you're analyzing a text, but really, when we're talking about just this, like, what is a plot? The plot is just what happens, right? When you read a famous Shakespearean play, right, which is not actually prose, so I probably shouldn't be using it, but I'm going to anyway because I'm trying to pick something that is most likely to have been taught in a school. So if you take something like Romeo and Juliet, right? Cool. It's about two teenagers who fall in love and then die. That is what the story is about, right? But then, of course, you can go into the themes of things like love, if they were actually in love, infatuation, which I would say is more likely. You can talk about all of these kind of things, which are the themes and what have yous that are also explored. Then you get, of course, the next thing is characters. Who is in the story? Kind of obvious. We all know what characters are. They're the people. They're the people in a story who are telling the story is told through them. You see, so it's kind of obvious what a character is. However, something that's very important is the characterization of the characters. Characterization refers to the way in which we learn about these characters. And now, in very, very broad terms, you get direct and indirect characterization. Direct characterization is when you read a book, and the book says, John was a bad person. There we go. That's very direct. We now know, you and I, that John was a bad person. I know. It's riveting information to learn. Now, you see, that is direct characterization. I'm just telling you the thing. Indirect would be, I show you, right? I'm not going to tell you that John is a bad person. Instead, in the story, I'm going to show you John kicking a dog. All of a sudden, now you're like, John is a bad person. You see, you've kind of arrived at that conclusion yourself, right? Although, of course, this can also be quite confusing to a lot of people, especially when something like fascism is in a narrative, and then they think that it's it's not criticizing them, it is instead actually condoning their actions, and you're saying, oh, it's so cool when they're terrible people. But that's a story for another time. So basically, direct and indirect characterization is a very, very major thing you will find in prose. There's many ways to do it. Direct characterization will generally be a person saying, like another character saying, John is a terrible person, or it could also be from other things. It could be the narration, just sort of saying he's a bad person. Indirect is much more. There's more to talk about. How can you tell what a character is like? How about I describe what they look like? What if I describe the kind of clothes that they wear? How about I describe the tone of voice they take with other people? How about I talk about how they speak to other people? If they're already rude to other people, they're always cutting other people short, they're always interrupting other people, they're never listening. All of a sudden, I now start to think, wow, this person is an insensitive, bad person. I don't want to swear for in case, people want to listen to this, students and such, so I'm not going to swear, but just think about them being a certain type of whole. You can show that through the way they interact with others. You could also say, how do other people talk about them, right? Not just saying that person is a bad person, that's a really lazy way to do it, but if you hear another character talking about a certain character in certain ways, you can learn things about them, right? Indirectly. You're not just being force-fed what they're like. You're not just being told, oh, they're terrible because of insert whatever. They're terrible because of a specific reason, right? Indirect and direct characterization, very important to understanding prose, and something that if you are doing analysis of prose, especially analysis of characters, it is the kind of thing that you should focus on. Characterization is very, 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 a couple more varies, important. Next, we're going to talk about space. Space is not the thing that's in the sky. Space is instead where it is told, right? The space in which the narrative is told. I've also put here the setting, which isn't strictly speaking necessarily correct, but it is also, it's one of those things. So the space is where is a story told, right? If I have, a story, a book, right, and the characters in one scene, they're in a bar, and then in the next scene, they're in a school. Okay, cool. That is the different spaces, which means that you need to conform to certain realities within those spaces. If you are analyzing a story, that is the kind of thing to also pay attention to. So let's just take those two examples, a bar and a school. Imagine the characters are in a bar, right? People are drinking, or whatever, and then all of a sudden a school bell goes off. That doesn't really make sense within that space, does it? You can't have characters in a bar with like a bell going off saying it's time for break or recess, depending on where you come from. And also, if you were say it's in a school and all of a sudden there's a bar that's in the school selling drinks, you'd be like, well, it doesn't really fit within that space, does it? So the space needs to make sense within the narrative for it to work. And the setting also works with that, right? Now, obviously, you can deviate from the setting and do certain things with the setting that are maybe not intended, but that doesn't really matter. So think about, right, you're going to have a sci-fi story. Okay, you have a sci-fi story, and for some reason there are, like, knights in it with, like, metal armor and swords and stuff like that. That doesn't really fit within that setting, right? It doesn't really fit within that space. But you could, of course, mess with something and do your own thing, like a Star Wars where there's basically space samurai. You can do things like that. So anyway, let's move on to the next thing, which is time. Narrative time. At some point in the future, I'm going to do a very in-depth video about narrative time because, to be honest, it is the thing in prose, in terms of narratology, that I probably know the most. And I think it's the thing that Genet did the best. Because he spoke about order, duration, and frequency. Right? These are the things that happen. Like, how does it happen in the story in terms of time? Right? The order, that's quite simple. What is the order in which the story is told? Does it start at the beginning? Does it start at the end? Does it start somewhere in the middle? Where does it start? And of course, if you're reading a story and then there's flashbacks to explain things, like to explain the characters, why is that done? Right? In terms of the order. Why is it out of order? Why isn't it... Imagine a movie in which we were like, we're going to take all of the flashbacks, and then we're just going to put them in the front in order, and then we're just going to watch it straight. Would it still make sense, or would it be kind of... Well, it would still make sense, I suppose, but you would also be getting the story in the incorrect way, right? You don't just have a story in chronological order. You can do all sorts of things with it. It doesn't really matter. It's up to you. Then duration is the other thing. How long do events last, right? If, say, for instance, I'm going to have a character who goes somewhere. They go on a road trip. And it's going to take them 12 hours to get to this place they're going to go. Right, they're going to drive 12 hours. Am I, as a writer, going to write 12 hours worth of writing to explain them driving there? Like, am I going to say, John turned the wheel a little bit to the left because there was a slight left coming up? And then a car was in front of him, so he decided to gear down so that he could get more acceleration to drive past them. And then we'll get... That would be weird, wouldn't it? It would be a very weird way to tell a story. Or you could just say, John left and arrived 12 hours later. You don't have to fill in all that time. You can just say it happened. Or, see, that's where you get things like summarization. How quickly does it happen in the story versus in the narrative? Frequency is also another thing. Think about this. You would assume, watching a movie, that all of the characters, say a movie takes place over the course of a year, let's just say. Yet we never once are shown these characters going to the toilet. You and I, right? We both know, right? We're humans, right? You and I, we're humans, right? You, whoever you are, you're a human like me, right? You go to the toilet, right? For a number one and a number two, you know, every day, generally speaking, right? You go to the toilet. You do. But you don't put them into your story, unless it's important to the story. We just assume that these characters go to the toilet when they need to pee, or they need to poo. They go to the toilet. We assume that when they are hungry, they eat. We assume that, seeing as it takes place at their job, the story takes place at their job, that they're driving there every day. We don't assume they live there. We don't have to be shown them sleeping every day. We just assume, oh, it's a new day. That probably means that they slept last night. We just know these things. You don't have to show these things. Let's say, at the beginning of a story, we see the characters eating. And then we don't see them eating again. We don't then assume to ourselves, wow, John only ate once in the story. He must have been starving. No, you don't. They only showed it once because it was only necessary to show it once. When in the real world, you go to the toilet all the time. You eat all the time. You sleep all the time. We are doing these things all the time. But they don't make for interesting stories, so you don't show them. We increase or decrease the frequency of events in a narrative based on whether or not they are pertinent to the story. You don't get bogged down in boring details. You could, but most don't. Okay, so that's time. I could talk about time for ages because there's actually way more, but this is a basic understanding of prose elements, so I'm not going to do that. Next, focalization. Focalization and narration are very closely related to each other, but are strictly speaking not the same thing, which can get very confusing. The focalization informs the narration, but they are not the same. They're not the same thing. Focalization can be kind of confusing for that reason, but focalization is basically the perspective from which a story is seen, right? How is a story seen? Who is the person that is focalizing the action? So focal as in like eyes looking. Who is perceiving the narrative? Who is seeing it? Whose perspective are we learning the story from? Which does not necessarily relate to the narration. They're not necessarily the same thing, but they should be understood next to each other. So let me just talk about narration. Right, narration is who is telling the story. All stories have narrators, all of them. You might think, oh, there's no narrator in this movie. There is. The narrator is the way that the camera is specifically framing the action, right? But now think to yourself, it's actually a really good way to think in terms of cameras instead of like in a book. Who's holding the camera? Right? Who is it that is recording these characters doing things? Is it a person that's actually there? Like, is the cameraman there in the story? Or is it an invisible person? Right? That's actually seeing it. Right? Who is doing it? Who is actually showing this action happening? Is it a character? You can take some... With movies, it's harder to do in the sense. But say, if you take a book, a first-person story, the focalizer and the narrator are the same person. Because if it's in first person, so remember, first person is when you say, I went to the shops, I was doing this is all about me. If you're doing that, then the person who's seeing the action and the person who is reporting the action are the same person. In terms of focalization, though, if it's, say, third person, this is not necessarily the case. The focalizer is the person through which it is being seen, but the focalizer could be all sorts of... It could be from anyone's perspective. So when it comes to narration, right, you get internal and external narrators. Is the narrator in the story or outside the story? When you watch the Marvel movies, right, those are external narrators. Because there isn't someone telling the story. The camera is telling the story, but the camera is not understood as a person. It is just something that is external to the action, but is recording the action, right? It is not actually part of the story, but it is showing us the story. It is external. Whereas then take internal narrator, something like Catcher in the Rye, right? The entire thing is from Holden Caulfield's perspective. He is telling us everything. He is also part of the story. Very fun. When it comes to narration, you also get first, second, and third person. Second person is not used very often, but yeah. So narration is the way, in a sense, right? The person, so called person, is how the narration is conveyed to you, right? A first person story is when it's saying, I went to the shops. Third person is saying they went to the shops, he went to the shops, she went to the shops, which is more external, right? It's sort of. It's someone who is recording the story but isn't part of the story necessarily. It could be, but not necessarily. Second person is not seen as very often. Second person is using you. So remember, first person is saying, I went to the shops. Third person is saying, he went to the shops. Second person is saying, you went to the shops. You don't get very many second person stories. Most second person stories are short. Like short stories and stuff. You don't really get that many long second person stories. You don't get like many novels that are in the second person. It's just not very common. It's a bit of a strange way to tell a story because it feels weird. But yeah, you see, so focalization, how is it seen? Narration, how is it told? Those are two different things, yet they are related to each other. They can be one and the same, but they are not necessarily one and the same. So that is a very basic introduction to prose/narrative. If you have any questions, you can pop them in the comments. And if you did enjoy this, or if you felt that it was beneficial, along with any of the other videos that I make, you can feel free to check out some of my books, perhaps. I had earlier just mentioned Fleshstone Blues, but you can read any of my other books. You can check them out. They are available in the description. You can get them. You can either buy them if you so desire, or you can actually get them for free if you go on itch.io. They'll both be out down in the description. You can just find them. So yeah, you might just enjoy them. You never know. If you don't enjoy them, then don't read them. Other than that, I hope that this was beneficial, and if it was not, I apologize profusely. Goodbye.